Hi, this is Hilton Giesno introducing episode 5 of TheMossShow. A few interesting pieces of news before we jump into the episode. On the actual homepage for the show at www.TheMossShow.com, on the right-hand menu about halfway down, there's a new heading there for topic or guest suggestions. And if you click through there, you'll see an actual voting site where you can go ahead and add a new topic or guest suggestion, or you can go ahead and vote on one that's there already. So please go through and add your opinions to the list that we've got up there. At the moment, the highest rated requested show is something to do with or topic around SharePoint 2010. So we'll see if we can arrange to have a guest come and talk about some of the exciting new stuff that's coming either for administrators or for developers in the 2010 timeframe. Of course, aside from actually an episode on this show, it's worth keeping track of what's going on in the media generally. And the best place to check out at the moment is sharepoint.microsoft.com, where there's some interesting videos on the upcoming 2010 stuff. So I'd say that's a good starting point to go and have a look. Some other news, TechEd South Africa is coming up in just a few weeks from August 2nd to 5th in Durban in South Africa. And I'll be there. I'll be giving 2 talks in the Office Client category, one on SharePoint Search and one on building a publishing site. So please come and check them out if you're at the event. And please also come and meet me and tell me if you're enjoying the podcast. Aside from the actual breakout sessions that I'm giving, though, I'll be hosting 2 panel discussions, and we'll be recording them as episodes for the podcast. So I want to ask all your listeners to please send in any questions, comments, or stories that you've got that you think might add up to a good discussion. The first talk is on user adoption, and the topic is SharePoint, build it and they will not come. So if you've got specific questions or war stories about user adoption that you want to share, then please send those in and we can bring those up as topics for discussion. The second talk is a SharePoint architecture panel discussion with Joel Olsen, Eric Harlan, and Zlatan Djinic. So it's an opportunity to ask or discuss any SharePoint architecture questions you've got with these very knowledgeable experts. So to send things in, just email me at feedback@themossshow.com. And if you're going to be at the event, then of course come to the panel and catch it live and be part of the audience as well. Talking about places where I'm going to be hanging out, I'll be in London for a few days at the end of August. So if you want to get together and have a chat, or maybe invite me over to convince your boss about why or how you could use SharePoint, then again, just drop me a line on the feedback@themossshow email address. And now our last interesting tidbit before we get into the interview, and maybe we need some intro music for this bit as well, but this is the tip of the episode. You may have heard about the small glitch with Service Pack 2 for SharePoint, that it can roll back your environment to requiring a license key. So there is a fix available for this, but after battling for a couple of hours this weekend, what I've discovered is that fix may not work depending on the version that you installed with. So I was installing with directly with an enterprise version rather than with a trial version that I'd entered a key into afterwards, and installing the patch actually seemed to lock me out. So I would say if you're in that situation, all you need to do is go and recapture the license key and don't install the patch, because it may give you some trouble. But as always, try and test in a testing environment before applying these things directly into a live production environment. Now on to today's guest. Sahil and I had a very interesting chat about SharePoint development, and he provided some great food for thought on a variety of different topics. In fact, we had quite a great discussion, and we got a little bit carried away on some of the points. So I've ended up splitting this interview into 2 parts, and this is going to be part 1. Sahil and I did touch on some points that he mentioned in a recent .NET Rocks episode, like getting into the 64-bit virtual machine discussion, and I didn't want to just repeat the DNR content, and anyway, I certainly can't hold a candle to Richard Campbell when it comes to anything really interesting. So I highly encourage you to check out that very, very awesome podcast at www.netrocks.com and give those guys some support for a great podcast that they've got there. Maybe they'll even send me an extra mug for giving them this kudos. But with that, on to this episode of The Moss Show, where we'll be talking with Sahil Malik about SharePoint development.
I was proud and I was standing. I was lost in a crowd. Now this room is abandoned. Everybody keep on fading out. I was strong.
So we're talking this episode with Sahil Malik, who is founder and principal of WinSmarts. He's been a Microsoft MVP and an iNeta speaker for a number of years, and as well as author of many books and numerous articles. And he's a consultant and trainer who delivers training and talks at conferences internationally. You know, over the years, as I've been looking for a particular problem or solution to a particular problem or investigating a particular topic in SharePoint, one way or another, I somehow always seem to come to your blog. So you've been doing this a long time, and not just working with SharePoint, but blogging about it and sharing your knowledge and your experience for a long time with SharePoint. So Sahil, welcome.
Thank you, Hilton. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. It's at 8 p.m. on a Saturday evening, and I guess that's what makes us developers. Instead of being out and about partying somewhere, I'm talking about SharePoint.
Yeah, it's only 2 p.m. here. One of the advantages of being in the States on the west side is that, you have more left in the day after the rest of the world has to, go to work sooner than us.
Yeah, well, we can probably make jokes that, we start the next day ahead of you guys as well. So it works both ways.
Yeah, well, that's true.
So here we're talking this episode about SharePoint development. Mm-hmm. And I guess maybe let me start off by asking you, in 2003, SharePoint was some sort of custom ISAPI filters, and it was a little bit of black magic with COM and a bunch of other sort of things in between. But there's so much Cell that 2007 it's ASP.NET, and it's all of the components of ASP.NET and C# development, and the API is all that rich. So are we even really going to have anything to talk about? You're not just sort of find a code sample on the net in C# and do what you're used to doing. What's the big deal with SharePoint development?
Oh, I mean, that's one of the things. SharePoint is one of those products which has its tentacles and arms into everything Microsoft. SharePoint in itself is so darn big, and it has so many applications and so much applicability. So yeah, while it's true that that SharePoint 2007 is really the first version of SharePoint that we've gotten that really takes advantage of .NET, but on top of .NET, you need to learn so much other Microsoft stuff, and then you learn SharePoint on it, and then it just makes you so much more productive because you have all these tools to work with. So actually, I'm going to take 2 or 3 steps back and go to my bio, because you notice I said for the past many years. I think it's either 7 or 8 years now that I've been an MVP and an iNeta speaker. So one of the things you would notice that in my bio, I don't mention SharePoint as a competency. I don't call myself a SharePoint MVP. I call myself an MVP. And to tell you the truth, I just consider myself as somebody who delivers solutions to their clients. And SharePoint is just one of those ways to deliver solutions to a client. And sometimes SharePoint fits, sometimes it doesn't. And it really depends on the project. So
how would you decide whether SharePoint's a good fit?
Sure. When you pick SharePoint as a platform, there are certain things that SharePoint gives you. Let's say comparison with .NET, because I work in the Microsoft space, so that's what I can compare it with. So there's certain things that SharePoint does that doing those in plain vanilla .NET would be just very, very hard. As an example, things such as Excel services or InfoPath or even enterprise search. If you had to write your own InfoPath, it would be just very, very difficult. But then there are certain things that are comparable that are, say, as an example, writing an ASPX is somewhat comparable, I would say, because of the development experience. Maybe it's slightly harder in SharePoint. But let's say Silverlight Zap file is pretty much comparable in the case of SharePoint versus .NET. But then there are certain things that are actually easier to do in .NET because the development tools that we use with SharePoint 2007 are not that great. And as time is going by, .NET is getting better and better, which we hope that SharePoint vNext is going to be so much better that we'll get another lead. But the idea is that depending on the nature of the project, sometimes it makes sense to use plain vanilla .NET. Sometimes it makes sense to use SharePoint.
I had an interesting discussion with a client yesterday who was asking me pretty much that same question. They've had a SharePoint project delivered by another party, but one of his first questions to me was, how do you decide if SharePoint is appropriate? And I think that's probably part of the question. It's not a simple matter in terms of just looking purely at the requirements. But I guess part of it also is, once you've got a hammer, everything becomes a nail.
That is a classic problem, and one of the challenges I think with the hammer nail situation that you described is there are people that will try and make SharePoint fit in every single situation. So let me give a core example. Let's compare SharePoint with ASP.NET MVC. If you want strict control on your URLs, if how the URLs are shaped is very important to you, if the generated HTML quality is very important to you, then chances are achieving the same in ASP.NET MVC would be easier than doing it in SharePoint. Now, it's not saying that SharePoint cannot do it, but it's just a lot more work to make it do that. I guess another way to look at this is that, as architects, we should stop thinking in terms of absolutes, that this is always the right answer and this always will work. Depending upon the situation, you may pick one versus the other.
Yeah, I think that's always the case we're facing. So now, assuming that we do decide that SharePoint's appropriate for us, and we've got this team of super hot ASP.NET developers, and maybe they haven't worked with SharePoint before. What's going to make SharePoint development different?
Okay, so let's say that you are somebody who has a good handle on ASP.NET, and now they come into SharePoint. So I have some good news and bad news for you. The good news is that your ASP.NET skills, more or less, are reusable in learning SharePoint. In fact, to be a SharePoint developer, you sort of have to be a good ASP.NET developer. But the bad news is that since the development tools for SharePoint are not as good, there are certain things that a regular ASP.NET developer is used to that don't really work inside of SharePoint. And then there is a whole long list of these. As an example, let's pick the example of authoring a master page for SharePoint, right? When you're writing a master page for SharePoint, the only tool that gives you the visual feedback on how this page is going to look like is SharePoint Designer. But SharePoint Designer is not the right tool to write C# code or VB.NET code. So you would typically write an ASPX that has VB.NET code inside of Visual Studio, but then Visual Studio doesn't give you that visual look and feel that a typical ASP.NET developer would be used to. And this is really a fairly simple example. But then let's pick another example where you have practices such as test-driven development and cruise control and all those stuff that we're so used to. Those things are harder to apply to SharePoint. Not impossible, but they're harder to apply to SharePoint. And that sort of increases your reliance on other development practices and things such as version control. In ASP.NET is also easier because in SharePoint in at least 2007 at least, you put a version number in the feature.xml, but it's really up to the developer to remember what version means what. And when you're deploying a new feature, what is that going to do to the existing features? So that's a challenge that you have to deal with.
So I guess part of it as well is that, a normal ASP.NET developer has a lot to come to terms with. Master pages is one thing, but master pages is just one of the things he needs to know. With SharePoint, I guess there's a lot of other SharePoint-related stuff. Where you mention features, and for those maybe who aren't familiar with them, you're talking about what they sometimes call features with a big F, with a capital F.
Sure.
It's not just a business feature you're delivering. It's the actual concept in SharePoint called a feature. Mm-hmm. It's sort of a package of functionality.
Yep, absolutely. That's the right way to deploy stuff, features and solutions, exactly. Now, it's interesting you bring up the point about that, when you walk into SharePoint, there's still a lot of stuff to know, even if you know ASP.NET. So I'll be the first one to say that I don't know ASP.NET. I mean, even within ASP.NET, there is so much to learn that I don't think that it is physically possible for any single human being to learn everything in ASP.NET. Every platform is a universe in itself. So, what I like to frequently say is the best quality you can have is how fast you can learn things and how fast you can unlearn things.
That's an interesting take on it.
Yeah, one of the classic examples I see is, how we've gone round and round about database access. You remember, we're talking of, non-SharePoint technologies here, but way back in COM world, we used to use ADO Classic. And the idea over there, Microsoft was focusing on a world in which you would have database abstraction, that you just write your query and then it runs in a database agnostic way, and the underlying abstractions take care of turning that query into something specific to the database that you're connecting with. Then they moved away from that in ADO.NET, and they started saying that we'll have a provider model. We'll still have some commonality, but you write queries that are targeted towards the backend source. And now we're going back to where we were, where we say and eSQL. This is a new way of doing things. You write your queries in eSQL and work in terms of objects, and we'll take care of the abstraction. And I assure you, one day we'll go back to going to a database specific. That's just the thing that with time you have to learn and unlearn new ways. And again, let's not think in terms of absolutes. And I think the same applies to SharePoint as well. That you have to be able to learn quickly and unlearn quickly because new things keep coming out. Now, Hilton, if you don't mind, let me ask you something.
Yeah.
You just installed SP2 because you sent me an email. You said there's plenty to play with, right?
Yeah.
Now, you sent plenty to play with, and before this, we had all those cumulative updates, and then we had SP1, we had the infrastructure update. Since SharePoint 2007 RTM'd, do you think SharePoint 2007 has changed a little bit until SP2 with all these updates?
Yeah, I mean, depending on what area you're working in, but yeah, definitely.
Sure, absolutely.
And that's in 2.5 years.
Yeah. It's been a long time too, I agree. But, I think that this is where the Office team is different from the dev div at Microsoft, that the developer division deals with the frustration of not being able to release stuff quickly enough. And they have to wait for the train to go before they can decorate the Christmas tree and send all their releases out. Whereas the Office team is just so much more quick in responding to the needs of the market. It says, search, we need federated search, and bingo, you don't have to wait for 2010 to see those things available. Just as, in a service pack or something, they make those things available.
Does that not talk to one of the points you were mentioning earlier? I think one of the reasons that we wait for those longer release cycles on .NET Framework is for the Visual Studio tooling to catch up. And you were mentioning particularly that, we struggle with the tooling in SharePoint. You think there's a link there, perhaps?
Oh, well, the tooling, Microsoft did release VSEWSS to make the tooling a little bit better for SharePoint 2007 as well. But between you and me and the millions of users listening to this podcast, VSEWSS still has some issues. And I would say, I don't want to go into statistics and not get into their political bickering, but a large portion of code today is being developed using open source tools like WSP Builder and SDS Dev. So as far as, waiting for tooling to catch up, Microsoft has been good at this, that they are able to release patches on top of existing version of Visual Studio. Like for WCF or WF in Visual Studio 2005, they released extensions for VS 2005. And then in 2008, it was built in. Now for 2008, they've released Silverlight tools, but in 2010, that'll be built in. So I think they have that story figured out quite well. But I think it's more on the lines of the actual .NET framework that they have to wait for the train to leave, and then they package functionality on top of the actual .NET framework.
Okay, so you think it's less about the actual Visual Studio tool. They have been, working on VSE, WSS, and there's version 1.3, available now.
Sure.
That, we'll have to watch that space. But as you say, the tooling is still lacking to a large extent.
Yeah, and especially with all those IIS resets, and at least if you recycle the application pool, and SharePoint is a big, complex ASP.NET app. You hit F5, and another dirty secret amongst us SharePoint developers is that we put a lot of stuff in the GAC. And, when you put stuff in the GAC, it's just harder to debug it. Sometimes your breakpoints don't get hit, or you hit you have to, hit an IIS reset, and that causes, the whole application to recompile again, and it's just you have to wait. And all of this stuff you're doing, you typically do it in a virtual machine, so it just makes things harder.
How would you advise new developers, not just coming to grips with SharePoint, but we find, the timing is, for exactly the reasons you're mentioning, the timing is longer to deliver the equivalent functionality, if you like, on a SharePoint project. Do you have sort of a rule of thumb that you apply in doing an estimate?
Oh, actually, when you say that the timing is equivalent or more in a SharePoint project versus a .NET project, actually that is something that I would say it depends on the project. As an example, I'll give you a simple example. Let's say you want to create a good-looking editing UI, and the editing UI needs to work like give some users forms, and they need to talk to say a back-end web service, and these forms need to be presented in a secure manner. I can assure you that with InfoPath and SharePoint, you'd be able to do this way quicker than in plain .NET. It'll be just insanely quicker. So as far as the timing goes, it really depends on the project. Sometimes, depending on the nature of the product, you may end up spending a lot of effort, and it may take longer to do it in SharePoint, in which case SharePoint is not the right fit. But in some cases, it is. Now, to answer your original question, how do you determine which project is suited towards SharePoint? I think that really depends. You learn that with experience, and I continue to learn every single day. But you just have to look at the project. So I think I can mention a few characteristics here. As I mentioned, if you need tight integration with the Office client, SharePoint is the right way to go. Right? That's one example, which is going to be very hard to build in .NET. If you need capabilities such as search, SharePoint is the right way to go. If you need the equivalent functionality of InfoPath forms, SharePoint is the right way to go. Let me talk about something about InfoPath a little bit. Just as an example, you can have a business analyst create a form, a browser-enabled form, that talks to a back-end web service that a developer writes. And then this business analyst can deploy this form, and this is something that actually I need to blog about. And you can actually deploy InfoPath forms properly through a QA development test environment, all the way to production. And this level of functionality, if you wanted to do it in just plain vanilla .NET, you would have to tie down a developer, not a business analyst. And chances are that it'd be hard to get consistent looking forms, because InfoPath is just very good at fidelity of those forms across different platforms, down to the level of the pixels that you see. And sometimes, depending upon the form, that fidelity is very important. So again, that is another example where you have SharePoint wins over .NET. And there are examples on the other side as well.
Let me ask you another take on that same example. Would you say there are other benefits than just the raw functionality that you might get by using that rather than going with a custom web solution? And an example of that might be that if you have a normal ASP.NET solution doing simple forms entry, not only is it potentially going to be quicker with InfoPath, but you have to then consider things like session state and scalability and things like that that you'd be getting out of the box using a decent SharePoint setup.
Mm-hmm. When you custom write a solution, I think what you're driving towards is that you have to worry about every aspect. That you have to worry about the database structure down to the how you're going to manage the view state, the session state, the authentication around the scenes. And when you work purely with SharePoint, all those things are done for you. So the best way I can sort of picture SharePoint is that you're building a skyscraper, and it's going to be 80 floors high, but with SharePoint, you get about 50 floors done for you, and you worry about the rest of the 30. Whereas in .NET, you're going to have to start from scratch, down from the foundation.
Well, I agree with you. The only drawback is if you're not used to SharePoint development, those last 30 floors are going to take you the equivalent of about 120 floor building.
Yeah, and actually that brings me to another point where this is a real problem. That finding good SharePoint skills is very hard. Now, there are a lot of people that will put SharePoint on their resumes, but to really find somebody who can look at the platform objectively and understand it properly and understand where it fits and where it doesn't fit, finding those people is very hard. And like any platform, the first time you do it, it's going to be harder. It's going to take longer. But if you keep doing it, you will come up with shortcuts and workarounds, and you'll know what works and you'll know what doesn't work. Let's take a classic example. When you deploy stuff to SharePoint, as I mentioned, the InfoPath forms. So an InfoPath form works, it's a UI and it's got one or more data sources behind the scenes. So the data sources can be an XML document, or it can be a SharePoint list, or it can be a database, or it can be a web service, right? Now, if you talk to a SharePoint list directly, then it becomes very hard to disassociate it from that list and point it to a different server after you have published the form. So typically it makes that, the proper development methodologies of QA and separate environments, that scenario becomes hard to support when you're using the backend source of an InfoPath form as a SharePoint list. But if you are talking to the SharePoint list through a WCF service, then it becomes easier to do so because you can change the reference to that service. Because it's such a huge platform, it is somewhat unrealistic for us to expect that its level of documentation would be the same as regular .NET, even though the documentation could need some improvement where it is now. But you just have to learn over time and see what things work, which brings me to one of the most important points about any SharePoint project, that you should prototype first, promise next. In SharePoint projects, that's extremely important. Sometimes certain things that you would just think that this will just work doesn't work. That thing is not available. And I can think of many such examples. Actually, let me give you one example on those lines. You have a column type called business data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have a list and you set up a BDC catalog ready and you add a new column type, and the column type is going to be a business data kind of column. Now, let's say that you wanted a business data column in a content type, like as a site column, right?
Yeah.
Sounds like a very reasonable request that you can do this. If you can add a column in a list, you should be able to add it in a content type. After all, why not, right?
Sure.
But you can't. When you try adding a site column, the business data is missing. And this was actually, I remember that was there in the beta 2, or maybe the beta 2 TR of SharePoint 2007. And then later it was taken out for some reason. I'm not sure what the reason was. But again, this is one of those scenarios which, sitting in a meeting, you'd say, yeah, we could do that. We could have a content type and we could connect a business data kind of column to a content type. But, you don't have that choice. It doesn't work, basically. So those are the kind of things you deal with.
What would you recommend to a developer faced with that kind of situation?
I think you should view every project objectively. Listen to what the client wants. Don't start thinking of how you're going to implement it yet. Listen to the full picture. And then so this is a bigger discussion. How do I approach any single SharePoint project? The first thing I try and understand, obviously, is a good description of the project, a statement of work. From there, I try and understand the various roles, right? What are the individuals that will be using this particular SharePoint site? Now, in any SharePoint project, one of the decisions that you'll have to make in the early part of every single SharePoint project is the logical layout of your SharePoint environment. And when I say logical layout, I'm talking distributing your functionality between sites or site collections and websites. So you decide sites and site collections and websites, and what drives that decision is the roles that you had decided first.
Sahil, can I just jump in to clarify? When you say websites, you're meaning web application?
Web applications, right. IS website, web application. Absolutely, you're right. Then, once you have decided the sites and site collections, and there are a few other things that you want to consider when deciding what becomes a site and what becomes a site collection. Security boundaries is one of them. Another thing that you need to consider are SLAs, because an individual site collection is easy to segregate in its own database, and therefore you have the ability to back it up separately and offer different level of SLAs on that particular site collection. Performance, quotas, the functionality available, branding needs different from department to department. All of those things are things that you would need to consider in your logical layout. The next step you need to consider is physical layout. Physical layout would be, you would want to consider the architectural needs of your application, as in what kinds of authentication will you support, what kinds of this drives what websites you'll have, what will be the database layouts, what are your performance needs, what are your uptime needs and high availability needs. And these decisions, actually, it's interesting that they're, right now when you have an extranet implementation, you typically extend a website between an extranet and an intranet and use two different kinds of authentication. So that is going to change in the next version of SharePoint, where you will have claims-based authentication. So actually, can we talk a little bit about claims-based auth also and how that'll make things different?
Yeah, let's jump into it.
Okay. So I believe claims-based auth is NDA, so I'm not violating any agreements to the best of my knowledge. But the way claims-based auth works is that you have, let's say you are a person who wishes to authenticate to a system, right? So typically today, what do? We either present our AD credentials, either Kerberos or NTLM, or we would present a username password, right?
Sure.
And then what happens if you have an application, a SharePoint application on which you have both internal and external users, you would have to extend SharePoint into two different websites, and one website uses AD, the other website uses Forms. Very typical. But then there are situations such as FBA breaks. Now in SP2, FBA has gotten fixed, but still you have different identities because pretty soon you're going to have this one user who is in Office, but he'd like to access his stuff from outside of Office, but he does not want a separate identity.
Of course, he wants to be the same user account regardless of where he's logging in.
Exactly. He's the same guy. So regardless of how he's logging in, it should be the same identity because it's the identity that really matters. So wouldn't it be nice if the user were to be able to present something that cannot be tampered with, a packet with some details about his identity. So let's say if I pull my driver's license out and I say, my name is Sahil Malik, my height is 5'10", my weight is so-and-so, and this is my birth date, eye color, and I present some details about my identity in a manner that the application trusts. And then it doesn't matter where I present that identity from, whether from inside or outside, that the application trusts this identity and therefore it is able to let me into the system.
So I'm guessing we're talking about some of the WCF related stuff, STS, authentication and things like that.
Actually, WCF can work with this, absolutely. But WCF, I would say, is a part of what we're talking about. Really what we're talking about is Geneva, codename Geneva, also called as claims-based authentication, which will be the way to provide identity to any application going forward. So in the Geneva framework, you have three things. You have the successor to ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services, which is a lot bigger and a lot better than ADFS now. You have the Geneva framework, and you have the next version of card space, which was something that was introduced with .NET 3.0. So actually, if you don't mind, let me chalk this down into a simple scenario. Today, you log into SharePoint, and what do? You HTTP to the site, and the server challenges you for some credentials, and typically AD credentials, and you would present your AD credentials, and you're in, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this is going to be replaced by step number one, that you would reach out to a website or an application provider and learn what are their authentication needs. Like, what do they need from the user to let the user into the system under a well-known identity? Then the user would talk to something called as an STS, Security Token Service, and it would request for that token, and the STS behind the scenes will talk to, let's say, AD or some other provider, but AD will definitely be supported. So it'll talk to a domain controller, and it'll get the token, and this packet, which contains the details about the user, is then presented to SharePoint or whichever web application, and now SharePoint knows who you are, and he'll let you in.
The uptake that I see in the market, probably just my experience, but WCS, card space, hasn't really been had a huge uptake. But baking it into something like SharePoint is likely to turn that around.
Well, actually, there is a portion of WCF, the well-known standard supported amongst all vendors and open source. It's called WS Trust. And WCF can work with WS Trust. So if you wanted to support Federation today and you wanted to have a smooth transition to claims-based auth tomorrow, you would want to use WS Trust. And that is a seamless way to move forward, because then later what you can do is that you can write a custom STS using the Geneva framework. And then using that custom STS, you'll be able to replace your custom code with, possibly a third-party STS talking to some other vendor's backend identity management store. But the cool thing about this whole thing that I'm talking about is that you can change the identity provider to your heart's content. you can change its implementation. You can change it from AD to forms to something that we haven't even seen yet. Even say Windows Live ID. Or you can have as many of these as you want. You can have one of these pointing outwards and one of these pointing inwards. You can have federation scenarios amongst different organizations, or you can have delegation over the internet. In all of these scenarios, your application, which is SharePoint, doesn't change at all.
Okay, so if we think back to the topic for the show, which is really focusing on development, what's the impact going forward to SharePoint Developer?
Mm-hmm. Well, the impact going forward is, at this point, I guess what you can do is you can learn about what claims-based auth is going to do and what kind of difference it'll make. Now, I'm not clear if going forward Microsoft's recommendation is to use claims-based auth with SharePoint or not, even though the current betas that are available for Geneva will work very nicely with SharePoint. I mean, they work seamlessly. But let's say that you wanted to support a scenario like I mentioned earlier, the extranet scenario where you have internal users and external users. But you can be sure of this, that you're going to run into a scenario where there'll be this user who's both internal and external, and he doesn't want two identities. He wants one identity, but two ways to log in. And you can support those scenarios using WCF and Federation and WS-Trust. So as a SharePoint architect, this is one of the things you'll have to decide. That you're starting a new project today. How is this going to affect your physical layout? What does this mean to your network topologies and boundaries? And where and how will you choose to extend your web application or not extend?
Okay.
And then once you've decided the physical layout, then you would have a couple of other considerations are the fine. We have our site set up. We have the security set up. The next things you'll need to consider in parallel are A, the branding needs, and B, the custom code needs.
Right, so let's explore that custom code one.
Sure. So in custom code, the way I like to see every single SharePoint project is that, at least my tendency in any SharePoint project is to write as little code as possible to be able to deliver an acceptable level of functionality to the client. And there are three reasons behind this. One, custom code is expensive. Second, any custom code that you write is potentially, not always, but potentially an upgrade nightmare at a later date when newer versions come out. And the third is purely because I'm lazy. I'd like to avoid writing code as much as I can. Now, a custom code in SharePoint is actually something that I try and minimize, because one of the things that I worry about is it is very easy to impersonate when you have access to SharePoint API. And the sandboxing is not that clear. So if somebody has the ability to deploy code into SharePoint, and for one reason or the other, in the real world, we deploy a lot of code to the GAC. Now, I know there are people who say that you can deploy to bin, but really managing those code access security policies is hard. Now, in an ideal world where we had peace in the Middle East and you had Michael Jackson was still alive and he wasn't weird, and still pumping out good music, I'd say, sure, go deploy to the bin. But the reality is that we have deadlines, we have limited budgets, and people are pressured. And the easiest way to get around that is take a shortcut and put stuff in the GAC. And a lot of people put stuff into the GAC. That is just the reality. So when you put stuff in the GAC, it is running under full trust. Is running under full trust means you have a lot of capability on the server. You can in your site collection, you can run some code that can talk to some other site collection and do whatever the heck it wants. So it's a little, the more code you have, the more code you're writing, over time, if you have larger and larger teams, it just gets harder to manage it. Not impossible. Everything's doable, but it just gets harder to manage it. So try and minimize code. But let's say that you do have to write code. Now, I haven't ever seen a serious SharePoint project where I had not have to write code. So you do write code. Then what you want to do is that the first thing before you start writing code is come up with a good versioning strategy. Very important for SharePoint projects.
So how do we come up with a good versioning strategy in SharePoint?
So when you're coming up with a good versioning strategy, one of the things you have to be careful of, as I mentioned earlier, is that the feature.xml version ID means nothing. In 2007, it means nothing. So when you're deploying new features, you have to make sure that both your C# code, the assemblies, and your feature.xml, there's some matching or some sense between those versions, and that it is you, the developer, who is responsible for understanding the impact of any new code that you deploy. So a good example is, say, when you retract a solution, the physical files will get retracted. But if there was a folder in the content database, that doesn't get deleted. Just as an example. And these are the things that, let's say, when you retract version 1 and you want to deploy version 2, did you really intend to delete that content database folder or not? And these are the things that you will have to decide based on your application needs.
And I guess most of this really just comes from experience from playing around with the things. As an example, if you delete a list definition, do you want to delete instances of the list as well? And to add some extra complexity, sometimes that may even change on a case-by-case basis within the same project.
Yes, and you really have to, you don't see heaven unless you die first, so you really have to...
Are we back at the Michael Jackson topic?
No, we're on Madonna now.
Now we're just being nasty, Sahil.
Well, anyway, Madonna used to be cool too at one point until she got leathery skin. But anyway, so, but yeah, you really have to, I think when you just write code and you're delivering functionality, it is easy to ignore what will happen to this in the future when you want to upgrade this. And what I'd say is try not to forget that future is going to be present one day and you'll be dealing with that, or some poor guy will be dealing with that after you. One of the things I like to do with the assemblies is that in assemblyinfo.cs, I like to mark the version as a.b.c.star. I like to leave a star in there. And the advantage of that is when you hit Control-Shift-B, that star will auto-increment on its own. And leaving one star is enough because it's an int32. That's 2 billion characters. By the time you build that many times, we'll all be wearing silver jumpsuits and commuting to Mars, so it's not going to be an issue. So leave one star in there, and I can't tell you how many times it saved my rear in trying to diagnose issues, and it was just because there was a different version over there than what I was expecting. So that's another, versioning strategies. Another thing that you need to, I think of is when you'd go from version 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, you need to think of a disaster recovery scenario which will take you from version 0 to version 5 directly. And again, development is a big part of it because all the custom code that you're deploying and you're dealing with data, existing data on the system as you deploy newer versions, simply deploying version 5 is not going to work because version 5 upgrades from version 4. You want to have some way to go directly from a fresh SharePoint install to version 5. And that's another thing you need to consider when you're writing your custom code.
So that becomes tricky depending on what your upgrade from 4 to 5 might be. Your 5 might be expecting pieces of 4 that it's going to explicitly try and upgrade.
Right. But this challenge is not typical to SharePoint. I think we deal with this challenge in databases as well, where, when you want to deploy a new version of code, you just replace, X copy and put new version and you're done. But in databases, you never do that. In databases, you always alter. You take a backup of your existing data, you alter the table, and then you put the data back in. And then you have to worry about if you're deleting a column, what do you do with the data lost? Or if you're adding a new column, what should be the values of existing data for that new column?
So what makes it harder for a SharePoint developer is that the sort of data storage and the schema is more intermingled with the code.
Right, because the data is stored sort of in the application, which is in lists and document libraries, and that is one thing you have to consider. But let me ask you something. You worked in SharePoint projects. Don't you think that in SharePoint the roles of IT, database, and developer have a higher degree of overlap versus other projects?
Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, it's a very difficult line trying to understand, and you can throw the user roles in there as well from a perspective of site collection administrator versus farm administrator.
Yeah.
The lines are a lot more blurred.
Yeah, and then you have a simple question like, should my user be a site collection admin? Well, I don't know. It depends on the project. Then
and the user.
And the user. Oh, yeah, that's right. I mean, I like to say anytime you come up with an idiot-proof system, they'll just come up with a bigger idiot. So, so that's one of the things the production or infrastructure people will say: developers do not get access to production. But the reality is, in SharePoint, there is so much that you can do through the browser. If you completely lock out your users and developers, then what's the point? Why you're not enabling the end users? So you got to loosen up a little bit. So I think it is just a sort of a judgment call you have to make. Again, something that you learn with experience, that depending on the nature of the project, sometimes you want to open up SharePoint a little bit so the user can take advantage of the platform, but not open it up so much that it's going to create a support nightmare for you.
That was the end of the first part. Join us next time for the completion of this conversation with Sahil Malik.
Out the window, everybody keep on fading out. Gone out the window, everybody keep on fading out.
If you've got any questions about any of the ideas discussed in this episode, or you'd like to give other feedback, like show topics or requests, then mail us at feedback@TheMossShow.com. To access the archives of all of our shows, browse to www.themossShow.com or www.TheMossShow.com.